Today's lecture concludes chapter number 12 in Wardhaugh and Fuller, Introduction to Sociolinguistics, and I'm going to be. This is the final part of the chapter, part number 1 we did last time. So I'm going to lift up a couple of concepts here at the final part, and then provide an example of how these notions of gender and sex and gender and language, gender and sexuality, how they kind of can be seen through the lens of power, and that's kind of hinted in the chapter, and I want to emphasize that. In the 1970s, Robin Lakoff came up with this idea. I mean, she put it in writing and published on it, and it's the notion of women's language. So she published a book, Language and Woman's Place, and it was kind of, in the early 1970s, it was kind of groundbreaking in the sense that while people had, of course, known that there are differences in how women and men speak, this made it explicit that there may be some differences. So she called it women's language, and it can be now referred to as the deficit model of language, that you lacking something and therefore you cannot perform as well as someone else, like women are lacking something linguistically and they couldn't perform as well as men. Of course, this is where we need to kind of start when we are interested in the differences between women's language and men's language, but we will see that the issue is not as simplistic at all. So fast forward a couple of decades, and we come to the difference explanation of women's language, that which was the biggest proponent of that approach, the difference approach, is probably Deborah Tannen, whom I've mentioned before. I'm a great admirer of her work, which is very readable. It became kind of it popularizes these issues of the differences between women's and men's language. And her basic claim is that women and men come from two different cultures. Even though boys and girls are raised in the same families, we still talk a little bit differently. To the girls, have different linguistic expectations for the girls than we have for the boys. So that was kind of like the basic idea, that even though we live within the same society and same speech communities, yet women and men, boys and girls and boys, they have been socialized differently linguistically. That a girl is supposed to be speaking in a certain way, a boy is supposed to be speaking in another certain way, and that's why we get the different speech styles, different linguistic choices that grown men and grown women make. There has been some research that people thought that maybe women have higher voices because there's a difference in the vocal tract, but there was this piece of research that was done on little boys and little girls, and according to this research, very early on already, children who are like three or four, of course, children, we can't, when we hear a little boy speak, a 1-year-old, 2-year-old, we can't distinguish whether it's male or female. But very early on, about 3-year-olds already, a boy is starting to speak like a boy, and a girl is starting to speak like a girl. So, like a girl, whatever that means. But these are, in a way, these are learned patterns. Girls hear how women speak, and they adopt that, and of course they don't have to, because whatever choices we make, we construct our identities according to those choices. So I can sometimes sound very much more feminine, but if I want to make a really clear point, I can use some quote-unquote masculine features of language and be very assertive and sound more like a man. It's interesting that the pitch differences that are real in men and women's voices, they are the result of for little children. It is, of course, there is also a physiological difference. Men have Adam's apples and women don't. But that is kind of secondary to the fact that a large woman versus a small man, they still sound like a woman and a man, respectively, unless they make a conscious effort to try to sound like the opposite sex. So, and that also happens. So we can use these features as identity builders. So Deborah Tannen pointed out that there is a difference in how women are expected, the girls are expected to talk, how boys are expected to talk. Her research has received some criticism because it's kind of like putting all the, especially the popularized books that she wrote. That's not what I meant, you just don't understand. These are catchy titles, and they're excellent books. They read really easily, and you can put it down when you start. But what she was criticized for is that she puts because these are kind of like self-help books. How can I get along in the world? How can I use language so that I get along? Or how can I understand why people don't meet my linguistic expectations? And it puts a lot of the burden on the women that we have to understand how men are different, and because they have been socialized differently, that is why they sometimes clash with our expectations. Anyway, that was the difference approach. But let's move on to the dominance approach, because I think this is what it's the richest approach in my mind to this sociolinguistic issue of women versus men. And not only women versus men, but also other categories, because it's very easy to make women as the linguistic victims in a way, and say, and I underscore this, that this is a vast generalization if we say that all women don't have, they are not appreciated as much as men, and it certainly is true in very many situations still today. But on the other hand, I want to emphasize that the speech situation is what determines how we speak. It's not only my gender that I'm kind of like a prisoner of, that determines that I always speak or use so-called women's language, the term that Lakoff made popular within sociolinguistics. So it's the dominance that I think provides the best example that actually explains linguistic differences. And the dominance is a feature that is defined by the speech situation. It's not defined by who you are. It is defined by what is going on in the speech situation. Because whether you are a woman or a man, whether you are gay or lesbian, whatever your ethnicity is, whatever your social class is, you may be in situations where you are the dominant partner of that speech situation, or the non-dominant part, or something in between, maybe sometimes even a completely equal part of that speech situation. And that's going to be reflected in the language. So I kind of want us to think about the situation as the defining feature that defines who is dominant, who has the power, okay? So in order to illustrate this, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own research, which I did on a novel, which is called Here Under the Northern Star. It's by a Finnish author, Väinö Linna. And I looked at the features that are associated, that were first associated with women's language, that the person who is more powerful obviously gives more, utters more imperatives, asks more questions, uses less hesitations, and so on. We talked about those features already last time on page 324 in your book. Some of these women's language features are listed. So use of tag questions, like isn't it? It's Monday today, isn't it? And rising intonation, also intonation pattern, isn't it? Or you can say it's Monday today. That sends the message of hesitation and non-assertion. If you say it's Monday today, then you are assertive, and that is not what Lakoff found or listed as part of women's features of women's language. Of course, women say the falling intonation part also, it's Monday today. And they can be assertive, so it's not like, if you're a woman, you will always do this. It's situation dependent. Hedging devices like, sort of, kind of, very, or quite, or perhaps, or maybe, and so on. So also women, according to Lakoff, would have used more empty adjectives, lexicon specific to domestic domains. This was in the 1970s. So yes, if we take this as the beginning part, then people found, other researchers, they found, but hey, in differences, it's not only women who use these features that were listed as features of women's language, because it's situation dependent. Who has power? The one who is dominant will not use these women's language features. But it's good that Lakoff started to look at differences between women's language versus men's language, because that revealed a very important social issue. Namely that women find themselves more often in situations where they are not dominant speakers. Even in family conversations, the father knows best, and obviously, if we have a society where men are always the bosses and women are their administrative assistants, then we have this kind of a society where women are not in powerful positions, and that is reflected in their language. It is not that they are women, but it is the positions that they tend to have. Okay? So, kind of elaborating on that, of course, nowadays we find women in leading positions, in at chief executive officers, university presidents, and very politicians, important politicians. So the world has changed. But women who are in these positions, we have noticed, and your book lists some research where women are subjected, if they are in these leading positions, they may be subjected to more criticism in terms of how they dress, how their hair is, how they speak, than a man in a similar kind of a situation. The language is also an interesting feature of, if we think of high-ranking women, if they speak, quote unquote, speak like a man assertively, they will be perhaps criticized for it, that they would be called like the B word, bitch, even though there is really no comparative term for a male who is assertive. So it's kind of expected. World hasn't kind of kept up with this change that women actually are in these leading positions. Some women who are in leading positions, if they use what Lakoff identified as features of women's language, if they are hesitant, they will not be taken seriously necessarily. So it's kind of like this, whether to try to speak like a man and then you're criticized for that, and if you try to speak like a woman, then you won't get things done. Nobody takes you seriously. They don't follow up with, if you're very indirect, for instance. Women have been found to be slightly more indirect, like for instance, giving a memo to the administrative assistant, saying, would you mind perhaps if you happen to have time to finish this memo for me? If you have time, thank you so much. By the end of the day, thanks. Whereas if you use the assertive approach, you say, I need this by 4 this day. Please make sure that you get it done. So imperatives, very clear instructions, none of these hesitations. Maybe you could help me with this. So if you are, so you see those two extremes. Okay, so dominance is that key thing that allows us to see how people speak. So let's look at this this novel. What I found was going on. I was looking at these features, like for instance, who speaks more, because the one who speaks more is typically in a power position. The one who asks questions are tricky, because if you are in a power position, like for instance, in the courtroom, you are in a power position if you can ask questions. So from the defendant, for instance, the defendant won't ask questions from the prosecutor or from the judge. So it's questions are very situation dependent. Where are you expected to ask questions? But imperatives are clear. The one who gives imperatives is in the dominant position. Think about army. The lowest ranking soldiers do not give imperatives to their superiors. But then the sergeants and all the way up from there, corporals and sergeants and all the way up from there, they they launch imperatives, they give orders to the ones below them. It's a very hierarchical system. And it's like an overtly hierarchical system. Other systems Like even in corporations, even though there is a clear hierarchy, people to an extent they have to assert the their own hierarchical status, especially if they are people who are not expected to be in those positions, women, minorities, and so on. And if they find themselves in those positions, it's a little bit more challenging to speak with authority that you are entitled to. Interesting stuff. So in this novel, there's the protagonist who is a tenant farmer. This is a novel that covers several decades of the history of Finland. And his name is Jussi, he's a tenant farmer, which means that he doesn't own the land that he tills. The land belongs to the parsonage, and who is in charge of that land is the pastor. So we have a clearly defined, non-linguistically defined power situation there. When Jussi goes to the pastor to ask if he could reclaim more land for his very small tenant farm by drying up a swamp, then the pastor is in a position of power to either grant this request to Jussi, the tenant farmer, or not. Okay. So in that situation, the power, the dominance is with the pastor, and Jussi is not the dominant person. But then when Jussi is within his family, his own family, when he speaks with his wife, Alma, he is in the dominant position. And he uses those power register markers, imperatives. He speaks more, he tells Alma what to do, and so on. Also, they have a son whose name is Akseli, and this is interesting because when the son is small, young, then Jussi is speaking to him pretty much in the same way as he's speaking to Alma, using a lot of imperatives: do this, don't do that, asking questions, very non-hesitant language, very direct language, and then what happens interestingly is when Akseli grows up and becomes a young man, he, with the language, indicates the change that he is now in a dominant position to his father because he's very capable and he can do a lot of things and his father needs him. So there we see a change that first Jussi is the dominant one in relation to his son, but then the roles are kind of switched when the son becomes a young man and Jussi becomes more, more aged, older and weaker and so on. There is a really interesting case, situation where Alma is giving birth to their first child, Akseli, and Jussi has to go and fetch the midwife. So we have a very a patriarchal system where men tend to be dominant, at least within the family, always depending on the situation. We have to try to avoid these generalizations that a particular group is always in a dominant position or always in a non-dominant position, because it's totally related to the situation that people find themselves in. So Jussi is typically, he would be expected to be giving orders to the midwife and say, hurry up, we need to go and get into my sleigh, and we'll go and help Alma to give birth. I need you need to be quick, come right away. But no, he's extremely hesitant, because who is in the power position in this situation when Alma is giving birth to Jussi's and Alma's first son? they need the midwife. The midwife, because she's needed, she is in the dominant position. And when Jussi speaks to the midwife, who is a woman, he uses a lot of the hesitations and indirectness. If you could possibly come, and so on. So I just wanted to point this out. You can look at fictional dialogues as well, even though they are fictional. But if they are done well, they reflect the societal changes, and there you can kind of see what the externally defined hierarchy may be, who is expected to be in the dominant position, and then see what the features of the language are. And that way we can learn fictional dialogues can also inform us about the power features of language. I'm going to leave it at that, and it's a good chapter to read. I do want to emphasize this fact, which I've said already a couple of times. It's not who you are, what you represent. That you may be a woman, you may be whatever your identity is, and of course identities are constructed and they may change, but that identity is not what defines necessarily how you're going to be speaking in terms, it's defined by the situation. So the speech situation is kind of like very important to take into consideration. Who you are speaking with, what the goal of the conversation is, what the setting is, what your activated roles are, and so on. All right.